They seated her below the salt again, at the very end of the long table where the candlelight gave out, and Lady Sabrina Fanshawe lifted her wine and said, loud enough for 30 guests to hear, that it was a mercy to let the poor governess eat at all. Laughter ran down the table like spilled water. Esther Marlowe folded her hands in her lap and looked at the cooling soup in front of her, and did not let her face change. She had learned long ago how to make her face a still pond. It was the one thing the years had taught her that no one could take away. They could move her chair down the table. They could speak of her as if she were a draught from a badly fitted window. But they could not make her flinch, and that small refusal was the whole of her dignity that winter. Everyone in Harewick knew of the almoner. No one ever thought to look at the governess they would not seat at dinner. That was the truth of the cathedral city in the winter of 1854, though not one soul in that bright dining room would have believed it. For 3 winters a quiet hand had kept the foundling ward warm when the coal ran out, had paid the apothecary when fever came through the almshouse, had left bread at the door of widows the parish had forgotten. The whole city wondered who the almoner was. The whole city guessed and gossiped and crowned the unknown benefactor a saint. And the whole city seated that benefactor at the cold end of the table and forgot her between courses. Esther was 26, and they called her a spinster left on the shelf, and they were not wrong about her circumstances, only about everything that mattered. She was the orphaned daughter of a physician who had died penniless, because he would not abandon his poorest patients, and she had buried him with her own hands at 19, and walked out of the only home she had ever known with one trunk, and a name that meant nothing to anyone. Now she taught 2 spoiled Fanshawe children their letters, and their French for less than a footman earned, and she was grateful for it, because it kept a roof over her head, and left her just enough, if she was careful, to do the work that gave her life its meaning. It was a strange grief, to be useful and unwanted in the same breath. The household leaned on her for 100 small things, and thanked her for none of them. When a letter wanted a careful hand, it was Esther who wrote it. When the accounts would not balance, it was Esther who found the error. When one of the children woke screaming from a nightmare at 3 in the morning, it was not the mother who came, but Esther, who sat on the cold floor and held a child who would cut her in the daylight, because a frightened child does not care who is beneath it and who is above. She had learned that lesson long ago, and she had built her whole secret life upon it. A frightened child only cares that someone came. So she came. She was always the one who came. And in the daylight they moved her chair down the table and spoke of her as a draught from a badly fitted window, and she let them, because the alternative was to want their good opinion, and she had cured herself of that hunger years ago, the way a person learns to stop pressing on a tooth that will only ache the harder for the touch. She thought the word without wanting to. Unclaimed. It was the word that had followed her since she was a girl. The unclaimed children in the foundling ward, left on the cathedral steps in the dark. The unclaimed widows in the almshouse, outliving everyone who might have wept for them. And herself, plain and quiet and past her bloom, an unclaimed woman in a world that measured a woman only by who wanted her. She picked up her spoon. The soup was nearly cold. She ate it anyway, because waste was a sin she could not afford, and because the children in the ward would have wept with joy over even cold soup, and she never once let herself forget that. "She has that look about her," Lady Sabrina was saying now, to the gentleman beside her, in a voice pitched to Carrie. "Have you noticed it? The look of a woman who has given up. Quite restful, really. One never has to compete." More laughter. Esther set down her spoon and reached instead for a slice of bread, and quietly, without anyone marking it, she wrapped it in her handkerchief and slid it into the pocket of her mended gown. It was for Wren, the smallest of the foundlings, a girl of 4 with a cough that would not leave her chest, who slept best when there was something in her belly. Esther would go to the ward tonight, as she went most nights, after the house was dark, and the Fanshaws thought her abed. She would go and be, for a few hours, the only person in Harewick who knew exactly who she was. The talk at the table had moved on, as it always did, to the only subject that interested them this season, the Duke. "They say he has taken the great house on Cathedral Close," said the Dowager Marchioness of Vane, who sat near the head of the table with the upright stillness of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outmanoeuvred the heirs of both, Aldermere himself, in Harewick, of all the dull places. "He is hunting a wife," said Sabrina, and she said it the way another woman might say she is owed a debt. Everyone knows it. A widower wants an heir, and a duke wants a duchess the whole world will envy. He will not find better than this city has on offer. She did not say herself. She did not have to. She turned her lovely head so the candlelight caught the gold of her hair, and the gesture said it for her. Esther listened, and felt nothing she would have called envy, only a tired and distant pity for whatever woman the Duke chose, who would be wanted for the shape of her face and the size of her dowry, and never, not once in her life, for the truth of herself. She did not know that night that the Duke of Aldermere had come to Herwick for a reason that had nothing to do with a wife. She did not know that he had been, for 3 winters, the only other person in England paying for the survival of her foundlings, and she did not know that he had come, very quietly, to find out who else was paying. The dinner ended near 11. Esther helped the housekeeper count the silver, because no one had told her to stop being useful when they stopped wanting her company, and then she climbed the back stairs to her attic room and waited for the house to fall asleep. Her room was the cold one under the eaves, where the wind came through the casement and the single candle guttered in the draught. She did not light a fire. Coal was dear, and every lump she saved was a lump that could go to the ward. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her cloak and listened to the great house settle around her, the creak of timber, the last footsteps of the servants, the slow descent into silence. When the cathedral bell tolled midnight, she rose. She had a way out that no one knew, down a servant's passage and through a side gate, whose lock she had long since learned to ease open without a sound. The night was bitter and clean, and the cathedral rose black against the stars over the sleeping city. She kept to the shadow of the close and walked quickly, the bread warm against her side. The foundling ward stood behind the almshouse, a low building of cold stone that the parish funded barely enough to keep standing. Esther had a key to that too. Matron Agnes Bray had pressed it into her hand 2 winters ago and said nothing, only looked at her with eyes that knew everything and would tell no one, and from that night they had been bound together by a secret heavier than blood. Inside, the air was close and warm and smelled of milk and lye soap. 2 long rows of small beds. A banked fire glowed in the grate, fed by coal that the parish had not bought. Matron Bray was sitting up beside the fire, mending by the light of a single candle, and she looked up when Esther came in and did not smile, because Agnes Bray did not smile, but her whole hard face softened by some small degree. "She has been asking for you," the matron said quietly. "The little one, her chest is worse." Esther was already moving down the row. She knelt beside the smallest bed, where a child no bigger than a folded blanket lay curled against the cold, and she put her hand to the small hot forehead and felt the fever there, and her heart turned over the way it always did. "Wren," she murmured, "I am here. I came." The child's eyes opened, glassy with sleep and sickness, and found her face, and something in the small body eased. "You came," Wren whispered. "I always come." She drew the bread from her pocket and broke off a soft piece and fed it to the child crumb by crumb, and she sat on the cold floor with the little girl's head in her lap and stroked the damp hair back from the burning brow until the cough quieted and the breathing slowed and the child slept. She did not know she was being watched. She did not know that the man who had taken the great house on Cathedral Close had a habit, in his sleepless hours, of walking to the ward he secretly funded to see with his own eyes that his money was doing what money so rarely did. She did not know he had come tonight, as he came most nights, and had stopped in the dark of the doorway when he saw a woman kneeling in the rushlight feeding bread to a sick child from her own pocket. She did not know he had stood there for a long time, perfectly still, and watched. Gabriel, Duke of Aldermere, was a man whom the whole of England feared a little. He had a cold face and a colder manner, and stormy grey eyes that gave nothing away, and a reputation, earned across a hard life, for caring about almost nothing. It was not true that he cared about nothing. It was only true that the one thing he had cared about most, he had failed. His sister, younger than him by 5 years, the brightest soul in a cold family, ruined at 19 by a man who promised her marriage and gave her a child instead, and vanished, cast out by their father, refused at every door that bore their name, and Gabriel, who loved her, away across the sea on the Duke's endless business, too far to be reached in time, too late by 3 weeks when the letter finally found him. She had died unclaimed, in a cold room in a strange city, with her infant taken from her arms by a parish that did not care whose blood it was, and no one of her own family at her side. He had come home to a grave with no stone. He had spent the years since trying to pay a debt that could not be paid, to children who were not his sister and could never be, in cities where no one knew his face, and he had come to Harewick because the ward here was the best run in England, kept alive by some hand he could not identify, and he wanted to know who, in a world so full of Fanshaws and Vanes, had the goodness to do in secret what he could only do with a duke's fortune behind him. Now he knew. It was a governess kneeling on a cold floor at 1 in the morning, feeding a foundling bread she had carried in the pocket of a mended gown. He left as silently as he had come. He did not let her see him. There was a thing he meant to do, and he meant to do it properly, and that meant he would say nothing yet. But standing in the frozen close with the cathedral black above him, the Duke of Aldermere felt something move in his chest that had not moved in a long time, and he understood, with the sudden clean certainty of a man who had wasted years being uncertain, that he had found what he came for. He had found her. He simply did not know her name yet. He found it out within the week, and the finding of it cost him nothing but patience. He had come to Harewick openly, as himself, and so the whole city threw itself at his feet. Invitations rained on the great house. Mothers paraded daughters. The Dowager Marchioness of Vane, who was his own great-aunt and the self-appointed guardian of his blood, descended upon him with a list of suitable young women, and at the very top of the list, underlined twice, was the name of Lady Sabrina Fanshawe. "She is the beauty of the season," the Dowager told him, in the cold drawing-room of his cold house. Over tea he did not drink. Excellent blood, a handsome settlement, and a face, Gabriel, that will make every duchess in England grind her teeth. You will not do better. You are 38, and you have no heir, and I will not watch the title go to your idiot cousin because you would not exert yourself. "I will meet her," Gabriel said. He meant it. He was a thorough man, and he had been wrong about a beautiful woman once before in his marriage, which had taught him that a lovely surface could sit atop nothing at all, like ice over a dry well. He would meet Lady Sabrina Fanshawe. He would give her every chance to be more than her face. But he had already knelt in his mind, beside a cold floor in a foundling ward, and watched a plain woman do quietly in the dark what the celebrated beauty would not have done in daylight for any prize on earth. He went to the Fanshawe house the following afternoon. Sabrina received him in a gown the colour of a winter sunrise, in a drawing-room arranged like a stage, and she was, he granted, very beautiful. She was also, within the quarter hour, entirely transparent to him. She spoke of herself in the guise of speaking of others. She let fall, with practised sweetness, 3 separate cruelties about women not present. She arranged her hands and her profile and her voice for his benefit, with a craft so total that there was, behind it, no person left at all, only the performance of one. And then a quiet figure came into the room with a stack of copybooks, a plain woman in a grey gown, eyes down, meaning to cross to the far door and disappear. "The governess," Sabrina said, with a little laugh, not bothering to lower her voice. "You must forgive her, your grace. She has the run of the house. We keep her out of charity. Her father died in debt and left her quite unclaimed, the poor creature, and one does what one can." There it was again. Unclaimed. Gabriel watched the governess. He watched her not flinch. He watched the still pond of her face hold steady, against a cruelty so casual that Sabrina had already forgotten it. He watched her dip the smallest possible curtsy and go on toward the door with her copybooks and her dignity intact, and he knew her. He knew the line of that bent head. He had seen it bowed over a sick child in rushlight. "What is her name?" he asked. Sabrina blinked, thrown for the first time. "Her name? Marlowe? Esther Marlowe. Your Grace, I cannot think why." "Miss Marlowe," the Duke said, raising his voice just enough to stop the woman at the door. Esther turned. It was the first time he had seen her face fully in the light, and he found it was not a plain face at all, only a quiet one, a face that gave nothing to people who had never given it anything. Steady, tired, intelligent. The sort of face you would walk past 100 times and never see, until the once you looked, and then could not look away. "Your Grace," she said. 2 words, level and low. "You teach the children here." "I do." "What do you teach them?" A small pause. Sabrina was looking between them now with the first cold prickle of alarm. "They're letters," Esther said. "They're figures, French and a little Italian. History, when they will sit for it." The faintest dryness touched her voice. There and gone. "They will not often sit for it." And the Duke of Aldermere, who did not smile, almost smiled. "Thank you, Miss Marlowe," he said. "That will be all." She went. The door closed behind her, and Sabrina, recovering her poise, laughed again and began to speak of something else, and never once understood that the most important thing that would ever happen to her had just walked out of the room in a mended gown, carrying a stack of copybooks. He came to the ward again that night, and this time he did not stay in the dark of the doorway. Esther was there, of course. She was there every night the house let her go. She was at the long table by the fire, going over the ward's accounts with Matron Bray, a small purse of her own coins open between them, and she was saying, in a low and worried voice, that the coal would not last the month, and she did not know where the rest would come from, when the door opened and the cold came in, and a tall man in a dark coat stood on the threshold. The matron rose at once, her hand going to her chest. Esther turned and saw the Duke of Aldermere standing in the doorway of the Foundling ward at 1 in the morning, and for the first time in years her still pond broke. "Your Grace," she said, and stood and put herself half in front of the table, in front of the accounts, in front of the children, with an instinct she did not stop to question. "This is no place for—" "I know what place this is," he said. He came in and let the door close behind him. He looked down the long rows of sleeping children, lit gold by a fire that the parish had not paid for, and something crossed his hard face that she could not read. "I have been paying for the coal in that grate for 3 winters," he said quietly, "through an agent, in another name. I never knew who paid for the rest." He looked at her. "Now I do." The silence in the ward was complete, but for the small sounds of sleeping children and the settle of the fire. "You are the one they call the almoner," he said. It was not a question. "The donation slips, the one signed with a little drawn bird. A wren." He drew something from his coat and held it out, and she saw it was one of her own slips, the small wren she always sketched in the corner, where another would have written a name. "I have collected these for a year, trying to find the hand that made them. I never thought to look at a governess seated below the salt." Esther did not answer for a long moment. "How did you come by that?" she said at last, low. "Reverend Soames gave it to me," he said, "when I told him I was the other one, the one paying for the coal. He thought it was time the 2 halves of this place knew each other. The Reverend Mr. Soames, the cathedral almoner priest, who had sheltered her secret for 3 years, who would not have given her away to anyone in the world he did not trust completely." Esther let out a slow breath. "Then you know," she said, "and I cannot stop you knowing, but I will ask you not to tell it." Her chin came up. "If the city learns who I am, Your Grace, I lose my place. The Fanshaws will not keep a servant the city fawns over, and if I lose my place, I cannot do this." She gestured at the rows of beds, the children, the warm room in the cold city. "And then who feeds them?" He looked at her for a long, long moment. "You spend your own wages," he said slowly, understanding it as he said it. "You go without, so they do not." "I have no one to spend them on but them," she said simply. "That is not a hardship. That is a purpose. Not everyone is given one." And the Duke of Aldermere, who had spent years and a fortune trying to buy himself a purpose to quiet his guilt, looked at a woman who had built one out of nothing but her own going without, and felt the last of his doubt fall away. He stayed an hour. He sat at the long table, and they went over the accounts together, the Duke and the governess and the matron, 3 conspirators by firelight, and for the first time in 3 winters Esther did not carry the weight of the ward alone. When the coal account came up, he said simply that it was solved, and named a sum that made Matron Bray sit down hard, and Esther said it was too much, and he said it was not nearly enough, and they both knew it, and she stopped arguing. When he rose to go, he paused at the door. "Why a wren?" he asked. She glanced toward the smallest bed, where a tiny shape slept at last without coughing. "There is a child here," she said. "We never knew her name. Someone left her on the steps in the dark with nothing but a scrap of blanket. So I named her Wren, because the wren is the smallest bird and the plainest, and it sings in winter when everything else has gone quiet. She looked at him. The world overlooks it entirely, and it does not care. It sings anyway. The Duke of Aldermere went out into the frozen night and walked back to his cold great house, and he did not sleep at all, and he was not troubled by it. Now, here it must be said, for the sake of every heart that has ever been overlooked and has wondered whether anyone was paying attention, someone always is. It may not be the one you hoped for. It may come years too late, or in a season you had stopped expecting anything good. But the quiet things done in the dark, the bread carried in a pocket, the wages spent on a stranger's child, the kindness offered when no one is watching and no reward is possible, these things are not lost. They are seen, if not by the world, then by the one who put the goodness in you to begin with, and sometimes, once in a great while, by a person walking through a doorway at 1 a.m. who has been looking for you his whole life and did not know your name. Hold to that in your own long winters. The lights are never as out as they seem. Now, let us see what came of it. They began, after that, to know each other. It was done carefully because Esther would allow nothing that touched the children's safety or her own ability to keep her place. But the Duke was a patron of the ward, openly now, and a patron has reason to consult those who run it, and so there were meetings that were not quite only meetings. They walked sometimes in the bare cathedral garden in the grey afternoons, talking of coal and children and accounts, and then by degrees of other things. He told her, one frozen afternoon by the dead fountain, about his sister. He had told no one in years. He told it badly in short, hard sentences, the way a man tells a thing that still cuts him, and Esther did not offer him comfort, because she understood that he had not asked for comfort, only to be heard. She heard him. When he finished, she said only, "Then you have been feeding your sister all these years. In every child you keep alive, you are claiming the one you could not." And he looked at her, as if she had reached into his chest and named the thing he had never been able to name himself. She told him in turn about her father, about the patients he would not abandon, and the debts that buried him, and the trunk she had carried out of her childhood at 19, about the years of being useful and invisible, of being the still pond, of teaching herself not to flinch. There were other afternoons, less heavy. He learned that she had a dry, quiet wit she let almost no one see, kept folded away like the mending in her cuff, and that it came out only when she had decided a person was safe. He found he wanted very much to be a person she had decided was safe. He, who had spent a lifetime being a man others were careful around, discovered that he would have traded all of it to be a man. This one woman was not careful around. She, for her part, was slow to trust it. She had watched powerful people her whole life, and she knew how lightly the powerful gave their attention and how lightly they took it back. She told him so, once, plainly, in the grey garden, that she did not know how to want a thing she could not afford to lose. "Then, do not want it yet," he said. "Only let me keep coming. I am very patient. I have been paying for that coal for 3 winters, and I never once asked to be thanked. I can wait for you longer than that." "You waited to be thanked for the coal," she pointed out, by no one knowing it was you. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I suppose I did." He looked at her with something close to wonder. "You see clean through a man, Miss Marlowe." "It is the only advantage of being invisible," she said. "One has a great deal of time to watch." "You make it sound a small thing," he said, "not to flinch." "It is the largest thing I have," she said. "It is the only thing they cannot take." "They will try," he said. "When they see what I have seen, they will try to take it. You understand that. The moment I show the city what you are, the Fanshaws and my great-aunt and Lady Sabrina will move against you, because you will have become the thing they cannot forgive, which is the proof that their measure of worth is wrong. Then do not show the city what I am," she said. "I am not going to be able to help it," said the Duke of Aldermere, and Lady Sabrina Fanshawe, who was not a fool, had already begun to see. She saw the way the Duke's eyes went in any room to the door, as if waiting for someone who would never come in by the front. She saw that he was unmoved by every art she possessed, arts that had brought lesser men and greater to their knees, and she saw, On a grey afternoon, from an upper window, the Duke of Aldermere walking in the cathedral garden, in no hurry at all, beside the governess in the grey gown. She did not scream. She did not weep. Sabrina Fanshawe was not a creature of heat, but of cold calculation, and she sat down at her writing desk, and she thought very carefully about how a beautiful woman destroys a plain one. You did not attack a woman like Esther Marlowe for her face. There was nothing to attack. You did not attack her for her conduct, because her conduct was without flaw. You attacked her where the world was most ready to believe the worst of a woman. You made her unchaste. Sabrina went to the Dowager Marchioness of Vane, who had her own reasons to want the Duke's strange fascination with a servant ended, and the two women, the beauty and the dowager, put their heads together, and out of that conversation came a plan as elegant as it was cruel. It used the child. It used little Wren. The story they built was this, that Esther Marlowe's devotion to the foundling ward, her secret nights, her spending of her own wages on a particular child, were not charity at all, but the guilt of a fallen woman tending her own shame. That Wren was no foundling, but Esther's own bastard, hidden in the ward to be visited in the dark. That the saintly Almoner was in truth a ruined woman, buying back her reputation with other people's pity. It was a lie. It was a filthy, perfect lie, because it explained everything the truth explained, and the world would always rather believe a woman wicked than believe her good. And to seal it, the dowager produced a paper, a forged note, in a hand made to look like Esther's, written to a man who did not exist, begging him to keep their secret and to remember the child that was theirs. It was a small masterpiece of malice, and the dowager had paid well for it, and she folded it into her reticule to be produced at exactly the right moment. The right moment would be the grand winter charity gala. The whole of Harewick gathered every year in the cathedral chapter house for the winter gala, the great event of the season, where the city's wealth was displayed in the name of the city's poor. This year the chapter house glittered as never before, for the Duke of Aldermere would be there, and the whole city had decided that this was the night he would at last claim the beautiful Lady Sabrina Fanshawe and make her his Duchess. They were half right. It was the night he would make his choice. They had simply chosen the wrong woman to expect. The preparations for the gala fell, as such things always fell, upon Esther. It was she who copied out the invitations in her careful hand, hundreds of them, until her fingers cramped. It was she who checked the lists and counted the chairs and soothed the cook and found, 3 days before, the error in the wine merchant's accounting that would have cost the Fanshawes dearly. She did the unseen labour of the bright night, while Sabrina stood before her glass, holding flame-coloured silk against her cheek and asking the air whether it made her look pale. "You would not understand, of course," Sabrina told her once, idly cruel, turning before the mirror, while Esther knelt to pin a hem, "what it is to be looked at, to walk into a room and have it stop. It is a great responsibility, Beauty, a burden, truly. You are fortunate in your way to be spared it." "I'm sure I am," Esther said quietly, and set another pin, and thought of a warm ward and a sleeping child, and was, in a way the beautiful woman above her could never have imagined, entirely sincere. Esther did not want to go to the gala. She was required to. The Fanshaws brought her, as they always brought her, to mind their children and carry their wraps and be useful and invisible at the edge of the room. She wore her one good gown, the dove-grey one, mended at the cuff where the mending barely showed, and she stood at the side of the great glittering hall and watched the city she had fed for 3 winters sweep past her without a glance. The chapter house blazed with light, 100 candles in the chandeliers, and gold plate on the long tables, and the smell of roasted duck and warm wine, and 1,000 hothouse flowers grown for a single night's show. Crystal glasses clinked. Silk hushed against silk. The whole bright machine of the city's vanity turned and turned, and at the centre of it stood Lady Sabrina in a gown the colour of flame, certain the night belonged to her. The Duke arrived late, as the powerful do, and the room turned to him like flowers to the sun. He moved through it with his cold courtesy, and Sabrina went to him, radiant, and the city held its breath waiting for him to lead her out. He bowed to her. He was perfectly correct. And then he turned, in front of the entire watching room, and looked down its length to where a woman in a grey gown stood at the edge of the candlelight, half in shadow, holding another woman's shawl. The room felt it before it understood it. The hush spread outward from the Duke like a ring on water, and Sabrina Fanshawe, who could read a room better than anyone in it, understood that she was about to lose everything in front of everyone, and she did the thing that desperate, cornered, beautiful people do. She struck first. "Your Grace," she said, loud and bright and trembling at the very edge, "before you embarrass yourself, there is something the whole city ought to know about the woman you have been so very charitable toward." The room turned to her now. "We have all heard of the almoner," Sabrina went on, her voice gathering strength as she felt the room's attention. "The Saint of Harewick, the mysterious benefactor of the foundling ward." She let a little laugh fall glittering and false. "I am sorry to be the one to tell you, but your saint is no saint at all. She tends that ward so devotedly because one of those foundlings is her own child, your Grace, got in shame and hidden in charity. I have proof." She turned to the dowager, who stepped forward with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman about to win, and drew the forged note from her reticule and held it up. "A letter," the dowager said, in her cold, carrying voice, "in Miss Marlowe's own hand, to the child's father, begging him to keep their secret." She let the room see it. "The little girl they call Wren is the bastard of Esther Marlowe. The almoner is a fallen woman." The chapter house erupted in a low roar of scandalized whispering, and Esther Marlowe stood at the edge of the light with another woman's shawl over her arm and felt the whole bright room turn toward her like a single cruel face, and felt the word she had carried her whole life close over her head like cold water: unclaimed, unwanted, and now unclean. She did not flinch. It cost her everything she had, but she did not flinch. She stood straight under the weight of 300 staring faces, and the loud false pity and the laughter beginning at the edges, and she made her face the still pond one last time, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that they would believe over a beautiful woman holding a piece of paper. The Duke took a step toward her, but before he could speak, before he could spend his power to save her, another voice cut across the chapter house, a hard, plain country voice, unused to grand rooms and not caring. "That is a lie." Every head turned. Matron Agnes Bray stood near the doors where the ward's people had been allowed to wait in hope of the gala's charity, in her good dress that was worse than the worst gown in the room, with her hard scrubbed face set like stone. "I am the keeper of that ward," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I have kept it 22 years. I know every child who has come through my doors and every soul who has helped me keep them alive. And I am telling this whole grand room to its grand face that what that woman just said is a filthy lie." "Matron, this is not," the dowager began. "The child Wren," the matron rode straight over her, "was left on the cathedral steps 4 winters ago, in the dark, by a woman this room knows well." She turned her hard eyes through the crowd. "Joan, tell them, or I will." And from the knot of poor women by the door, a thin, work-worn almshouse widow stepped forward, twisting her hands, terrified, brave. "Wren is not Miss Marlowe's child," Widow Joan Tasker said, her voice cracking and then steadying. "She is my sister's, my sister Mary, who died of the fever the winter she bore her, with no husband and no help and no one but me, and I could not feed my own 3, God forgive me, so I left the babe on the steps where I knew the ward would take her." Tears stood in her eyes, but she lifted her chin. "It is in the parish register. Mary Tasker, the true mother, dead and buried these 4 years. Reverend Soames wrote it himself. Anyone may go and read it. The child has a mother, and her name was Mary, and she is in the ground, and Miss Marlowe never did anything but keep her sister's baby alive when the rest of you would have let it die on the stone." The chapter house had gone utterly silent. The Reverend Mr. Soames came forward from the side of the hall, grave and certain, and said, in the trained, carrying voice of a man used to being heard in a cathedral, that he had the register, that he would fetch it that very night, that the forged note in the dowager's hand was a forgery he would swear to, for he knew Miss Marlowe's true hand better than anyone living, having received 3 winters of her donation slips, each one signed not with a name, but with the small drawn figure of a wren. He let that land. She named the child, he said quietly into the silence, after the smallest, plainest bird that sings in winter when all the rest have gone, and she signed her every gift to this city with that same small bird, asking nothing, taking no credit, wanting no thanks. For 3 winters this city has wondered who its almoner was. His eyes moved over the glittering room. She is standing where you put her, at the edge of the light, holding someone else's shawl. And now, at last, the Duke of Aldermere spoke. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. "You call her ruined," he said, and the cold in it stopped the breath in the room. "Half the children in this city are alive because she went without her own supper to feed them." He walked down the length of the chapter house, past Sabrina, who had gone white, past his great-aunt, whose forged paper hung forgotten in her hand, past the long tables of gold plate and the staring faces of the people who had seated this woman below the salt for 3 years, and he did not look at any of them. He stopped in front of Esther Marlowe. "You have spent 3 winters asking who kept your foundlings alive," he said, turning now to face the room, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "She is standing where you placed her, below the salt." The silence broke into a sound like a held breath released all at once, 300 people understanding at the same moment what they had done and who they had done it to. The Duke turned back to Esther, and the cold went out of his face entirely, and what was left was something the city of Herwick had never seen on the Duke of Aldermere, and would talk of for the rest of their lives. "I came to this city," he said, low now, "for her," though the silent room drank in every word, "to find the person who did in secret the only good I knew how to do. I thought I was looking for someone like myself, a person with a fortune and a debt to pay." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I found a woman with no fortune at all, paying a debt that was never hers, out of wages that barely fed her, asking for nothing, signing her name a small bird so that not even gratitude could find her." His voice roughened. "I have known beautiful women. I married one. I have never in my life known a worthy one until I knelt in the dark of your ward and watched you feed a sick child bread from your own pocket and did not know your name." He held out his hand to her, palm up, in front of the entire watching city. "Esther Marlowe," said the Duke of Aldermere, "I am asking you, not the governess they would not seat at dinner. You, will you do me the honour of becoming my wife?" The chapter house did not breathe, and Esther, who had not flinched through any of it, who had stood like stone through cruelty and lie and shame, found that this, finally, was the thing that broke the still pond, and her eyes filled, and her hands trembled on the borrowed shawl, and she looked at the man holding out his hand to her in front of all the people who had looked through her for years. She did not take his hand. Not yet. She lifted her chin and she spoke, and her quiet voice, that the room had never once troubled to hear, fell into the silence as clear as a struck bell. "I do not want your name, your grace," she said. "I want your word that no woman is ever turned from that ward again." The Duke of Aldermere went still, and then slowly he smiled, the rare and total smile of a man who has just been given exactly the proof he did not know he was still waiting for. "You have it," he said. "Before God and this whole city, you have my word." "Then yes," said Esther Marlowe, and she put her hand in his. The chapter house came apart. Some part of the crowd, perhaps shamed, perhaps moved, perhaps only carried on the tide that carries crowds, began to applaud, and the applause swelled and broke over the room like a wave, and the people who had seated her below the salt rose to their feet for the woman they had fed on cold soup and contempt. In the middle of it, the Duke drew Esther's hand through his arm and bent his head, and said for her alone, "You truly would have let it all go, the name, the title, all of it, if I had said no to the ward." "In a moment," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I said yes." Lady Sabrina Fanshawe stood alone in her flame-coloured gown in the middle of the room that had been hers an hour ago, and watched the Duke of Aldermere walk past her with the governess on his arm, and understood that she had not merely lost. She had, with her own hand and her own lie, in front of every person whose opinion she had spent her life courting, destroyed herself, and held up the woman she hated into a light that would shine on her forever. The Dowager Marchioness of Vane quietly let the forged note fall from her fingers, and turned and left by a side door, and was not seen in Harewick society again that season. And little Wren, brought to the gala in the matron's arms, because the matron would not leave her sick on a night that decided so much, lifted her small hot head from Agnes Bray's shoulder, and saw across the bright loud room the only face in the world she trusted, and said, in a voice too small for anyone but the matron to hear, "Esther came." She always came. They were married in the cathedral in the spring, when the frost had gone out of the close, and the first green showed in the bare garden where they had walked. It was not the grand society wedding the city would have staged for a duke. Esther would not have it. She was married in a plain gown, before the people who mattered to her, with matron Agnes Bray standing as near as a mother, and Reverend Mr. Soames reading the vows, and widow Joan Tasker weeping happily in a good new dress the Duke had quietly seen her given, and Lady Honoria Drax, the blunt and formidable old patroness, who had recognised Esther's quality at the gala, and lent it her own considerable standing, sitting in the front pew like a fierce guardian, and daring anyone to murmur. And in the very front, in a small new dress, sitting between the matron and the Duke's own household, was a little girl who had stopped coughing at last, watching with enormous solemn eyes, as the woman who had fed her in the dark was given a name and a home and a whole new life. Esther Marlowe became Esther, Duchess of Aldermere, and the city that had looked through her for 3 winters could not now look at anything else. But that is not the end of the story, and the end is the part worth waiting for. Let 3 springs pass. Let the cold, great house on Cathedral Close be cold no longer. Esther had filled it, slowly, room by room, the way she did everything, without fuss and without waste, until the house that had echoed like a tomb when the Duke first took it was loud now with the right kind of noise. Fires in the grates, children's feet on the stairs, the smell of bread instead of dust. For one of those children now was Wren. The Duke and Duchess of Aldermere had claimed her, not as a charge or a charity, but as their own, raised in the great house with every right of a daughter, the smallest, plainest bird brought in out of the winter at last, and taught that she would never be put back out in it again. She was 7 now, and sturdy, and the cough was a thing of the long ago, and she had the run of the house the way only a thoroughly beloved child can. The foundling ward had become something the city of Harewick now boasted of to visitors as though it had built the thing itself. The Duke had endowed it past any fear of want. A school, chartered and permanent, with proper masters and a warm dormitory and food that never ran short, and a charter that said in plain words that no child and no woman in need would ever be turned from its doors. Esther had seen to that clause herself. It was the only condition she had ever asked of anyone, and she had asked it twice now, and gotten it both times. She had asked one thing more, when the charter was drawn, and the Duke had not expected it, and could not speak for a moment when she did. She would not let the school be named for herself. The whole city had wanted it. The Esther Marlowe Foundation, the Aldermere Charity, something to carve her vindication in stone. She refused all of it. She named it for a woman who had died unclaimed in a cold room across the sea, cast out for a child the world would not forgive, with no one of her own at her side. The Eleanor School, the charter read, for the Duke's sister, so that the woman the world had thrown away was honoured at last, every day, in the warmth and the bread and the saved children, in the one currency that had ever mattered, which was the safety of those no one else would claim. The Duke had stood in the chapter house when the charter was read out, and had not been able to look at his wife for a moment, and when he could, she saw on the hard face of the most feared man in England the look of a man whose oldest wound had finally, after all the years and all the fortune spent against it, begun to close. "You have claimed her," he said to Esther that night. "Lo, what? I could not. You put her name where it can never be taken down." "We claimed her," Esther said, "and we go on claiming her, every winter, in every child that does not die on the steps." She took his hand. "That is what the grave needed, not a stone. a school full of fed children with her name over the door. They went together, that next morning, the Duke and the Duchess, to the churchyard where, at last, a stone had been raised over a grave that had been bare for years, and they tended it, and it was bare no longer, and it was unclaimed no longer, and the word that had haunted them both their whole lives was, at last, and for good, answered. As for Lady Sabrina Fanshawe, the brilliant marriage she had made in haste, the season after the gala, to a viscount with a great name and a greater appetite for the gaming tables, had gone exactly as such marriages go. Within 2 years the name was the only thing left, the fortune drunk and gambled away, the viscount mostly absent and entirely useless, and Sabrina, who had spent her whole life trading on her face, learning the hard arithmetic of a face that is no longer quite new in a world that had never valued anything else about her. She came to the great house on Cathedral Close on a grey morning in the 3rd spring. She came on foot, which told its own story, and she stood in the fine hall she had once expected to be mistress of, in a gown 2 seasons old and carefully mended in a way that Esther, of all women, recognized at a glance, and she asked, with the last of a pride that cost her terribly to spend, whether the Duchess of Aldermere would receive her. The Duchess of Aldermere received her. Sabrina had prepared herself on the cold walk over for any number of cruelties, for the cool eye and the slow smile, for the pleasure of the powerful repaying the powerless in her own coin, for being seated, perhaps, below the salt. She had earned all of it, and she knew she had earned it, and she had come anyway, because she had nowhere else to go. She did not get any of it. Esther rose when she came in, and crossed the room herself, and took both of Sabrina's cold hands in her own warm ones, and did not let go. "Sabrina," she said, "sit by the fire. You are frozen through." It undid the other woman entirely. Cruelty she could have borne. She had armoured herself against cruelty. She had no armour at all against the one thing she had never in her life shown another woman, and the tears she had sworn she would not shed came anyway, hot and shaming, and Esther sat her down by the fire and gave her tea and waited, without a word, until she could speak. "I came to ask for charity," Sabrina said at last, bitterly, staring into the cup. "I, who told a chapter house full of people that you were a fallen woman. I have nothing left, and a child coming, and a husband who will not be sober to see it born. And I came to the one person in England with the most cause to shut the door in my face, to beg." She laughed, a small broken sound. "Because I knew, you see, I have always known, that you were better than me. I think that is why I hated you. It was unbearable to be near." Esther was quiet for a moment. "I will not give you charity," she said. Sabrina's face closed. She nodded once stiffly and made to rise. "No, of course. I understand. Sit down," Esther said, not unkindly. "I said I would not give you charity. I did not say I would not give you anything." She looked at the proud, broken woman by her fire, and there was no triumph in her face, none at all, only the steady grey gaze that had once held against a whole cruel room. "Charity is what you give someone you look down on. I am not going to look down on you, Sabrina. I had a lifetime of being looked down on. I would not wish it on my worst enemy, and you are not my worst enemy. You are only a frightened woman who was taught that her face was the whole of her worth, and then lived long enough to watch it stop being enough. That is not a sin. That is a wound. I know something about wounds." She set down her cup. "The Eleanor School wants a teacher," she said, "for the small ones. Their letters, their figures, a little French. It pays honestly, and it is honest work, and it will keep you and your child fed and roofed, and no one there will ever know or care what you said in a chapter house 3 years ago, because the children do not read society pages. They only need someone to be patient and kind with them." A faint, dry warmth touched her voice, an echo of the governess she had been. "They will not often sit for history. I should warn you." Sabrina stared at her. "You would let me near those children," she whispered, "after what I am." "I would let you become what you could be," Esther said, "which is something none of us did for you, when we were all so busy admiring what you were." She rose and held out her hand. the way another had once held out a hand to her across a silent room. "Honest work, Sabrina. It is the making of a person. I should know. It made me." And Lady Sabrina Fanshawe, who had had everything the world could give and lost it, took the hand of the woman she had tried to destroy, and wept, and said yes. She became, in time, a good teacher. Not at once, and not easily, for the vanity of a lifetime does not wash out in a season. But the children did not care what she had been, and there is no cure for a wounded pride like a small hand trusting yours. And the woman who had measured every soul in Harewick by its usefulness to her learned, slowly, in a warm schoolroom full of foundlings, to be useful to someone else. Her daughter grew up in those same rooms. It was, in the end, a better life than the brilliant one she had grasped at, and she knew it, and she never quite found the words to thank the woman who had given it to her, but she did not need to. Esther had not done it to be thanked. She had signed every good deed of her life a small bird, precisely so that thanks could never find her. There is a morning to end on, the first truly warm morning of that third spring, when the frost had gone for good and the cathedral close lay golden in the early light. Esther had a notion the night before that there should be soup given out in the square, free to anyone who came, children and widows and the old and the poor and anyone at all. No questions asked and no one turned away, in the open, in the sun, where the whole city could see how its poorest were fed. She had expected to organize it and oversee it from the side, as she had overseen everything her whole life, useful and a little apart. She had not expected her husband, but when she came down into the square that morning, there was the Duke of Aldermere, the feared and the cold, the pinnacle of the aristocracy of England, in his shirt-sleeves with the sleeves rolled up, standing behind a great steaming pot, ladling soup into the bowls of a long line of ragged children with his own two hands. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him, and her heart was too full to hold. He looked up and found her, the way he always found her in any room, and the cold face broke into the smile that only she and a handful of fed children had ever earned from him. "Well, Duchess," he called across the warm, bright square, over the noise of 100 children loud with food and sun. "Are you going to stand there being seen, or are you going to come and work?" And Esther, Duchess of Aldermere, who had once stood at the edge of every room holding someone else's shawl, walked out into the middle of the light and rolled up her own sleeves, and took up the ladle beside her husband, and went to work feeding the children, with Wren underfoot and laughing and the spring sun warm on a city that had finally learned to see her. The word that had haunted her whole life was gone. There was no one unclaimed in that bright square. The children were claimed. The widows were claimed. The dead sister across the sea was claimed and tended and honoured in stone and in a schoolhouse full of saved lives. The smallest, plainest bird had been brought in out of the winter for good, and Esther herself, who had spent 26 years believing herself an unwanted woman that no one would ever choose, stood claimed at last, and chosen, not for a face or a fortune or a name, but for the one thing she had thought no one would ever trouble to see. The world had looked straight through her for years. It had simply never once thought to ask what she did when the lights were put out.